Hi, everyone. My name's Ed Aymar, and I'm so excited for today's panel. Before we start, I want to say thank you to the Suffolk Mystery Author Festival for having us, and especially to Kathleen Kelly for putting all this together. Everyone at Suffolk does such a wonderful job. I've had the chance to participate a few times, and it's just an awesome experience every time. And hopefully we can be in person again soon because the community down there is so warm and welcoming. As I said, my name's Ed Aymar, and my novels are The Unrepentant and They're Gone, and No Home for Killers, which is coming out in February of next year from Thomas and Mercer. And as I said, also, I'm so excited for today's panel because it's rare that you get to talk to writers whose work you admire, but you also consider good friends. Although I should say, I don't know how they feel about me. But I will ask Alex Segura and Eliza Nellums to introduce themselves momentarily. Then we'll do a Q&A mixed with a couple of readings from their fantastic books, Secret Identity and The Bone K. So Alex?
Thanks, Ed, for putting this together, and I'm so excited to be on this panel. I'm a crime writer and comic book author. My latest, Secret Identity, comes out March 15th from Flatiron Books. It's a comic book noir set in 1975 New York. It stars a Latinx woman, Carmen Valdez, who moves from Miami to New York to work in comics, and she basically ghostwrites a hit character and her collaborator is murdered. So she has to basically solve the murder of her friend to reclaim the character, the lethal links. And the book has comic book sequences in it, which is fun because I also work in comics. So you get to kind of read the prose novel and then hop into the comic book adventures as you go. So that's me.
Great. Eliza? Should I jump in? I don't need an introduction. I'm Eliza Nellums. My second novel, The Bone K, just came out. I'll be talking a lot about my first novel today, All That's Bright and Gone, in which the protagonist is a 6-year-old girl. She's also the narrator, and it's in first person. So we're really getting in her head and sort of trying to get that identity. And my second novel, The Bone K, just came out, and is about a woman who declines to evacuate during a hurricane and instead stays in a historic estate that she is restored because she sort of has this idea that by being there, she can protect it from ruin, which, spoiler alert, is not true. And I live here in Washington, D.C., just outside the district. I think we're all East Coast writers, Alex from New York and Ed also in the D.C. area. And it's really great to be here. Thank you for having me.
And I read both of these books. Eliza's, as she mentioned, came out in December, was it? And Alex's comes out in April?
March 15th, my birthday, actually.
Oh, March, yeah. So, and they are so good. I was so excited to read them. And I read both of I've read your previous work. For both of you, these books both seem like not that you weren't writing well before, but there's a step forward here. There's like an assured sense of tone that's really excited when a writer reaches that. And you know you're definitively reading an Alex Segura or an Eliza Nellums book. But my first question, and I sent these questions ahead of time so you would have a chance to review them, is a lot of your books full of hardcore sex. How did you research that?
Sex dungeons. It's actually, you can just at any time join. It's open. Sorry, God, my parents are going to watch this. Sorry. Yeah. Wrong panel, Ed.
Okay, then I'll start with a different question.
I'm just like in shock still. still really.
I got up pretty early in the morning to be on a panel with Ed.
Yeah.
I gotta say, and I hope this doesn't get cut, Katie, but I have this real cool noir shade thing going on with my office. This is like half my.
I'm seeing that. You got a background blur, but like
it's kind of funky because you've got the blur thing.
Really
going on
fits in, yeah.
It's almost like you're angelic.
Let's spend some more time talking about this.
Too.
Yeah. You're not wrong. So as you mentioned in your intros, you each wrote about, and one of the things I thought would make a great concept for this panel, you each wrote about characters that are sort of outside of your identity, who you don't necessarily represent or identify with.
And you as well, and in your books also, you're joining the conversation. Your characters are also female a lot of times. Right?
Yeah. Oh, we're going to spend most of the conversation talking about my stuff.
I hope so, because I'm not prepared.
I mean, this is an Ed spotlight panel, right?
Most of this is going to be about me,
Ed.
but just to fill some time.
Okay, great.
Did you ever shy away from a character because you're worried about authentically portraying their voice?
I'll start with that, Alex, and then you can jump in. Otherwise, as a woman, it's hard to get your shoulder in sometimes. Just kidding.
Yeah.
I did, in the beginning of the draft of my first book, I spent more time on the mother character who's suffering from mental illness. And in the final product of the book, there are letters from the mother cut in between the main action of the story, which is not from her point of view. And I debated how much more time I wanted to spend in that character. I had debated doing alternating points of view for the whole novel. But having not experienced a mental health crisis to that degree myself, it felt a little too derivative. To me, I know I'm in trouble if I'm ever like using stuff I've seen like on TV or in movies or whatever. That's the sign that you're like not authentically embodied in that experience. And I try to look up first person perspective accounts of how people who are individually experiencing things have described their own experiences, but it's still not the same thing. And I did back off that character because I just didn't think I could deliver her fairly. And I know a lot of people have experience with mental illness, and there are voices out there that can tell their own story of that experience. And so I just sort of decentered her in the story. She's still there. She's still experiencing a mental health crisis, but it's not really her story. And that was sort of my reasoning. Alex?
I want to touch on one thing real quick before that, Alex. So
I'll just be quiet.
Yeah. Shut
You're gonna need more coffee. More coffee.
One of the you mentioned something there where you said when what you were writing was informed by cliches, you
Right.
kind of realized that it wasn't. Is that something that's just kind of like a sort of warning system for you? I think that's really interesting.
To me, that's always a red flag. Even with the action of the mystery, if I'm like, I think I borrowed this from an episode of Bones, I'm like, okay, back up. It's always a sign that you're not truly like.
So then you lean into it.
Yeah, or you lean into it. Yeah, right. You can lift the plot, but like you're gonna want to do some research or something. To me, TV just if something that's good in a movie or TV probably is not going to translate well to a book without a little more interpretation, a little more texture, a little more sort of embeddedness in that account. So anytime I'm like ripping off Die Hard, I'm like, no, I don't. I just, that's the sign to me that like we need to get a little deeper here because it's going to be better in Die Hard than it's going to be on the page if I'm just copying the action. Just a personal rule. I'm sure other
or
people
Die Hard with a Vengeance.
Die Hard with a Vengeance.
Entire library.
Any of the Lethal Weapon, bad sign.
Sorry, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Carmen is a Cuban American woman. She's a queer woman who moves from Miami to New York to work in comics, and that's I think the challenge we face as writers is characters sometimes show up for us, and we have to embrace them to kind of have them resonate. I think, but I think also there's always going to be work involved. If you're speaking outside of your own experience, and I hate to call it experience. I mean, it's someone's life. It's just not my life. So I did some research on my own. I had a lot of beta readers and sensitivity readers that could kind of nudge me and let me know if what I was doing was not was not accurate, or if there were things I could kind of focus on to be more genuine. But I also, when you're writing outside of your own life, you have to be mindful that you're not the person that should be trying to write a definitive experience. I think it's important to have diverse characters. I think it's important to have characters that the reader maybe isn't familiar with. And I think that's important, but I think as a writer should never try to write the definitive experience for another life, something that I don't have firsthand experience on. And so I was mindful of that. Carmen obviously goes through a lot during the story and experiences a lot of different things, but it's not my place to be writing the definitive queer experience.
So yeah, I think adding on to that, I've personally thought of the rule as being like, it shouldn't be about someone's coming out story or something.
I didn't want to make it a plot point. That's right. Exactly right.
They can be a character with a diverse background, and that's cool. But I wouldn't, if it wasn't a perspective I shared, I wouldn't like anchor the story in that moment, or if that's the major plot point, if that's not an experience I share with them. But if they're solving a mystery, they can still solve the mystery with me. That could be the point.
Yeah, because I mean, we want diverse characters leading these books. I never want to just relegate a character to being a supporting character just because I'm scared. I think there's something to being brave about it and trying to kind of embrace the challenge, but also being mindful that it's not your life or your experience, and you are not meant to be speaking to that.
Hey, because ultimately we're always going to be writing about someone who's not us, right? I mean, to an extent. I mean, you could. I mean, there's exceptions, right? If you're writing, very, very, very thinly concealed memoir or something, but every character is going to have a difference that you're just doing your best to capture.
Yeah, and I think you always, I think nowadays you see a lot of pushback, be it online, like, well, I should be able to write whatever I want, and no one's saying you can't write whatever you want. I think now there's just a greater expectation on doing the work and doing your homework and making sure that what you're putting on the page is as accurate as you can make it, and thoughtful. I think thoughtful. I tried to be as thoughtful as I could throughout the process.
Yeah, I think there's a degree of responsibility. The more marginalized the perspective you're interested in writing about, the more research you better be putting into that. I've written male main characters and I wasn't that concerned about it. I mean, I don't know how
Who cares?
authentic they were on the page, but like, come at me, bro. Like, I wasn't concerned about feeling that identity. Whereas like, I would have to spend a lot more care and effort into a more marginalized identity. And I would certainly think harder about it. And like, why is this a character that appeals to you? Are you sure you're not just trying to like exploit any sense of exoticism, or getting a cheap way to make the character more sympathetic by making them a marginalized identity that you think that the readership will identify with? Like, I don't think that's quite good enough to just say, well, it'll make the book sexier because it's about a less commonly understood character. Like, great, I want sales. Like,
yeah, I mean, you're not playing a game. You're not playing a game where you kind of pick things to make something more interesting. It's really like, why have you decided to write this character? And I think for me, it's a lot of times the character shows up fully formed, and you kind of have to then build the book around the character.
Mm-hmm. I think, what do I have in common with that character? What is it about that appeals to me? I would guess that, Alex, there's a reason that character that you wrote resonates for you, and it's something about your shared experiences or shared perspective, or there's a reason why that's the character you wanted to tell your story through.
Yeah, I think it's I have a lot of friends that are Cuban American that have gone through that experience, and it felt genuine to me, but it's also, again, not my place to be telling that seismic experience. It's more, she just happens to be a queer woman who is going through this, and I think it adds to the narrative.
And everything about Alex's book, it's so layered, and you don't really get that from until you read it. At least I didn't expect how complex it would be, and it took me like when you read most good books, right? Afterwards you think about it, or you see a good show or any kind of good artistic experience, and stuff occurs to you later. I remember talking to Eliza about your book, and then later thinking like, oh, that's why you did it. That's why, and everything about it just I thought worked so well.
Well, thank you.
One thing for each, we talked about creating characters. What do you do? Is there a typical thing that happens for you? Does a character come first and then introduce a story, or do you come up with the story first and then the characters come second, or does it happen all in one full-fledged thing, which makes you a bit of an asshole because it shouldn't be that easy?
I went first last time, Alex. You go.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think it's mostly character, but it is often both simultaneously, though I always lean towards character, because if the characters are boring, then I won't care. As a reader, if the characters are boring, I don't care about the plot. Like, I'm not a plot reader. I read about character. I want to learn about their problems and their obsessions and their vices. I knew I wanted to write a mystery in comics, and I knew the era, and then Carmen kind of appeared, and I never expected it to happen again. Like, for me, the Pete books, Pete showed up and he was pretty much defined for me. And it was easier to step into his shoes because he had a lot of similar experiences to me, whereas Carmen's experiences were similar in that she was a Cuban American, but she was from a different time. So she was kind of from my parents' era as opposed to my time. And but I really leaned into her and what she was like and what her conflicts were and what her goals were. And she's such a polar opposite to Pete. She's very put together. She's very driven. She's very prepared and focused, whereas Pete is just a mess. Like, even at his best, he's a mess. Like, he's just a charming screw up. But I always default to character, even though I am a plotter, an outliner, and organized in terms of the beats of the story. If the characters aren't there, it just becomes like a shell.
Does one of those characters or the other resonate more for you, Alex? Are you more of a hot mess, or are you the organized?
I would say I was.
Look how he's dressed. Come on.
Yeah,
man.
I would say
I would guess, but
I was once a Pete, and now I'm a Carmen.
Nice. Yeah.
I loved, by the way, the and this isn't a spoiler, but the Pete reference.
Oh yeah, I
book.
thought people. Yeah, it all my stuff happens in the same universe. That's the kind of obsessive in me.
It's very comic book, right?
Yeah,
Comic
yeah,
book.
exactly. There's actually 2 references, but no one has caught the second one.
Oh, well, you don't know which one I got.
I'm assuming it's the easy one.
Yeah, it was. Eliza?
I think because I write mysteries and because I'm trying to be more professional in my approach to writing and write mysteries completely, I resist my instinct to start a book with the first thing that comes into my mind, because it's usually something useless, like a scrap of dialogue. Like, I think when I was learning to write, I would try to write an entire scene so that I could use a scrap of dialogue that I thought was great or something. And I'm really trying not to do that anymore. I try to write books based on scenes that I've thought about. I'm also an outliner. So I have a lot of characters in my head, but I think I start a novel when I have a interesting plot that has its own internal sort of urgency. I think that's what I'm like, this would make a good novel, would be the idea of a character in this circumstance. And the circumstance itself is inherently has stakes and has a deadline and a ticking clock. And the character kind of is the easier part to me, that fills itself in pretty easily. So I try to think of what would be the most interesting character to be in that circumstance that I've decided would be interesting to write a book about. So that's probably a bit lengthy and nerdy for our audience. Maybe our audience is full of nerdy writers. I don't know.
Yeah.
But like a hurricane, I was interested in, okay, the hurricane has its own timeline. It will have an intrinsic interest, which is important, I think, when you're trying to write a good arc and add a little suspense.
It's a great looming danger.
Right. It's a looming danger. I mean, they're slow as molasses, but your book will be forced to move forward as the hurricane approaches, which is great. And then I think I tried to think of what is the most difficult character to encounter a hurricane. And it would be like a very finicky woman who wants everything to be the same and who is very oriented on preserving the past and restoring things to a certain standard. That would be someone who would be especially troubled by a hurricane approaching. So I think the plot did introduce the character for me in that case.
It's a great slow. I mean, I used the hurricane in Blackout, the 4th Pete book, and it's a great like just slow burn, because you can have like the clues at the beginning of the book, and then eventually it's heading to everyone knows, but no one knows how powerful it's going to be.
It doesn't quite take over the whole book either, because they are so slow, and it's not. No one was ever surprised by a hurricane. It's not an earthquake. It's not a 1-minute scene.
But they're terrifying. I mean, having gone through a ton of hurricanes in Miami, it's a nightmare.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say I start with character and then try to think of a story for them, although I know many writers do very successfully. What do you do, Ed? We're going to put the question back to you.
Yeah, I just want to say that with the Bone K, I love that about it. I'm very envious of writers who have good elevator pitch books, because I don't. I think my books, like, to me, they're an elevator pitch. When I try and describe them, I'm not getting that, like, here's what happens.
Your new one has a good elevator pitch.
It does, but it doesn't have that sense of,
give us the pitch.
Well, no, I'm thinking of the. I will. Trust me, I will. But the Chain, by Adrian McKinty,
yeah,
right, had this great pitch of your child's. I think it's like your child's kidnapped, and the only way to get your child back is to kidnap somebody else's child. Right. And I thought, a high concept pitch. I love that. And and with the Bone K, you get that, but I think it's so rare to get, like, because the whole book takes place through this hurricane, like the start to the end, and you're immediately sort of submerged into it. Although the hurricane doesn't open as the book opens, but it's the presence of, like you said, it's ominous. Yeah. And it's very hard, I think, to write a thriller that has that kind of elevator pitch, but also has these wonderfully deep characters like the Bone K does. I loved the kind of subtle strength, and I can't remember the protagonist's name, the caretaker. Magda. Yeah, I love Magda's strength and how it kept coming out at times, or fading away, or the mistakes that she made. I don't want to give any spoilers
no
away.
spoilers. Yeah, I think most writers have lots of ideas. I assume we all spend our days going around thinking like, this could be a good book. This could be a good book. I certainly do. Alex apparently
I'm
does
just
not.
kidding.
That's weird, Alex. So you're not a real writer. Anyway,
I'm a fraud.
yeah. Well, comics are probably different. I don't know.
We just paint pictures and look at them.
But I think we do have the luxury of choice, especially once you're in the publishing world and you have agents and editors that you're bouncing ideas off of. So I try to go with the ideas that have some sort of pitch like that. And maybe if it doesn't have that, I'll think like, well, I could fold that into a different story that has a bigger pitch. I also just really want to keep things moving, and knowing myself as a writer, I'll get bogged down if I don't. So like a massive hurricane coming will stop you from having like long scenes in cafes where characters like thoughtfully discuss philosophy. Like, and I need that reminder to like keep it going. Like in the first book that I wrote, there's a little girl and her mother's missing. And in the first draft, it was just a little sluggish. And so I added this ticking clock of like exactly when she was expecting her mother to come back from the hospital, and a deadline of what would happen if she didn't get back in time. Something the little girl wanted was going to be missed. And then I like reinforced that in a lot of scenes. Like, if mom doesn't come back by this time, then this. And suddenly the whole book got a lot more energy and a lot of lift. And I could tell that was worth doing. So now I try to think of settings that already have some of that. It's just stakes, basically.
Are there I was thinking about something and now I'm a little sidetracked because I was thinking I'm doing Wordle at the same time. So
yeah.
It's a tough one.
I'm answering emails, but
I'm just checking Twitter.
And stop texting me, Ed. I'm trying to.
No, I was thinking about something. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it as a question.
More of a comment.
Yeah, but it's fine. I'll
Why are you
leave
bad?
that. No,
I'm not answering your questions to us, Ed. I want to hear your answers.
Oh yeah, okay. So my book, No Home for Killers, is coming out in 2023. As I said, the elevator pitch is troubling, abusive jazz musician is murdered, and his two estranged sisters, one burned out former social worker, the other a secret vigilante, are brought together to find out what really happened.
It's very good.
Very character driven. Obviously, the characters are essential to that.
Yeah, and I tend to write from women's point of views.
Sure.
Third person almost always. And I don't want to try first person because I feel that's too much of an assumption, sort of. And I think as a writer, especially if you're writing outside identity, sometimes it seems like you're with first person, maybe you're trying to show off or trying to work too hard. At least that's how I felt it would be my approach. So
that's interesting.
I felt like that gave me a little bit of a distance where I'm telling a story. I'm not looking at somebody, right in the eyes. I'm looking at them, from a side profile.
Yeah. You're the omniscient narrator there, Ed.
Yeah.
I'll do third person, but pretty tight. I think I'll keep it limited.
Yeah. The but it was there with my characters, I felt fairly safe. I don't know why. I didn't feel like I have had beta readers look at certain parts to see if I'm getting elements of it right. And Alex, you mentioned with Carmen that you used beta readers and sensitivity readers for that. Was that the first time you've done that?
I've always had beta readers. I've always had a core of people that I would bounce manuscripts off. I'll do the first draft for myself and then read it and mark it up. And then by the second or third draft, I'm ready to share. And I've always had a core of like 5 to 6 people that I'll share an early draft with to get feedback, even with stuff like the Star Wars novel, like things that are work for hire. But with Carmen, I wanted to have sensitivity readers. I felt like I needed it. And I think it was important to have people, that had share that life experience with her that could give me insight that I wouldn't notice. And I think I was pleasantly, it was great that the feedback I got was mostly that, you're doing a good job, but there were always great notes too that kind of nudged it in the direction that I thought it needed to be in to be as close to authentic as I can make it.
What about you, Eliza?
I have not had sensitivity readers. I had planned to I mentioned in that first book, I backed off the character who was mentally ill. I had planned to have a sensitivity reader if I had continued that and really made her a character, like a sort of a playable character, as it were, versus a sort of a drive-by, one shot and then gone character. And I think it's both important and difficult to find somebody who would be the right reader, because I think it should be as close as possible to that experience to be accurate. Otherwise, I think we just always, whether we know it or not, fill in the pieces we're missing with assumptions that it's inevitable that you're going to do that. And when you're coming from a privileged place, your assumptions are probably going to be informed by racism or ableism or, all the isms, whether even when you're really, really, really trying your best. So I would want to have had a beta reader who had the specific illness that the mother was attributed to have and had actually been institutionalized, which is difficult to find. That's work. I'm not saying I wouldn't have done it. I mean, that's what it would have taken, I think, to feel good about having that character as a playable character. That's what I would have needed to do. Luckily, in the rest of the books, I didn't have a character that I felt that concerned about. My first character, who's a 6-year-old, is in first person, but I was a 6-year-old, so I was like, I think I can claim that. I'm not a 6-year-old now.
You didn't skip from 5 to 7.
They're not tough critiquers, those 6-year-olds, because they can't read. So I wasn't worried too much about 6-year-old Twitter blowing up at me and being like, mostly they can't type, so that's great. That's exactly the kind of marginalized identity you want to borrow, is one who's not on Twitter. And I did spend a lot of time trying to remember being 6, and people frequently said to me, like, you're not a parent. It's kind of strange, which is true, that you wrote this child character when you're not a parent. And I'm like, I think it's critical that I'm not a parent, because I would be projecting my hopes and dreams for my children onto the character, or like my perception of them as an adult, or any of those things. And this character is 6. So instead, I tried to be really embedded in my memories of being 6. I had a journal from that time. I asked my parents a bunch of weird questions, like, I don't think this character actually probably sounds like a real 6-year-old. It is a literary conceit. They don't write novels, so the character in question can't actually write. So there's no way that this was her story, but the actual experience of being a small child was what I tried to anchor it in. And I couldn't find a really great beta reader, although I asked my niece, but like, she did not have the attention span at that time, being 4.
I mean, kids are just the worst beta readers.
Yeah, God, no, and they're not timely either. You try to set a deadline.
Their handwriting is also terrible.
Yeah.
Basically, if it's not right in front of them, they're not going to do it.
Yeah.
A lot of writers like that, actually.
But you did use you ran for the Bone K. Didn't you work with a poet to help you with poetry?
Poet. There's sort of like the mother character. There's flashes to a poet who's not on screen as a actual character, and I did have a real poet read those and help me with them, because I knew I'm not actually a poet. So I was fortunate, because I'm doing that thing where you try to describe a genius, but you yourself are not a genius. So you can't actually give like a genius poem on the page, because I'm not a genius poet myself. So it was a lot
not yet.
With just evocative titles or just 1 or 2 fragmented lines, but I wanted to make sure that they passed at least a sniff test in terms of those lines. So yes, I had a real poet, Sandra Beasley, who was fabulous and who I knew from a writer's workshop I had done. And I paid her, because I think it's important to pay people who work for you to actually read all the snippets of poetry and give me advice. And she did, and gave it with a poet's sort of eye. So that was critical, because again, you don't know what you don't know. So as a non-poet, I was like, yes, this fragment of poetry is moving the plot and foreshadowing. And she's like, okay, let's
start at 0.
Yeah, let's start over. So that was very useful.
Did you consider, and this actually is a question for Alex as well, and this is a little outside of the panel, but something I'm just curious about. Did you consider working with, like having a poet write those poems? So it's like a collaborative effort?
I did. I think that would have had to be like from the beginning, and I would have had to open up the book and be much more open to her, like not her personally, because I know she's a very busy lady. She actually gets paid and works and probably would not be interested in my crappy projects, but a different poet who maybe was looking to break in or something. I'm a control freak about my own work, so I would struggle with that, I think. But I certainly considered it, but it would be a totally different book, totally different project. You'd have to be willing to change it how they wanted to change it, Alex, what about you?
Yeah, for you, I mean, given that your book includes illustrations and includes parts of the comic. I mean, how did you possibly, like, for me, I like writing because I really don't have to share unless it's on my own exact.
That is my favorite thing about it.
Yeah, unless it's my own parameters, right? And I'm saying like, I need this, like that. Otherwise, a collaborative project, and I collaborate with people, but generally with people who aren't writers, because I just hate writers. Or with like musicians or painters. But how was it working with somebody for your own book to have comic book sections?
It was, I mean, it was fun. I mean, I write comics as well. So I think they use different parts of my brain. Like we were talking about novels, or you're in complete control. You have, until it gets to your agent, you have say over everything. And it's kind of like a weird little God complex. But with comics, it's like you said, much more collaborative. And it's almost the closest example I can get to it is playing music with someone. You're jamming and you're hoping that the two or three different parts come together and make something cool. So with the links sequences in Secret Identity, I had a rough idea of what I wanted them to be, and I needed to find the right artist. And Sandy Jarrell, who drew the sequences, I'd worked with before, and we knew each other from comics. And he's a great storyteller, but he's also like a student of the medium and of history, so he could evoke the style. And the idea was, you read these sequences, and if you're a comic fan, you read them and you think, yeah, this could have come out in 1975, and it feels like a 1975 comic book. And so he could do that. And we had a great little shorthand. I said, this will probably be a 2 or 3 page sequence. Like, let's try and evoke this kind of comic. And this is what should happen, which is not traditionally how comics are put together. Like, there's 2 paths. You can do like a full script, which is like a screenplay, and the artist just draws what you say. But there's also something that's called the Marvel method, because it was made popular by Marvel Comics, where the writer will send a paragraph to the artist, and then the artist kind of has directorial leeway to do what they want. And so we went that way. And now I'm probably getting too much in the weeds, but I would give him a couple sentences, and he drew the page or did a layout, and then we'd go back and forth, and then I would write the script based on that. So it was fun, and it was a nice change of pace from the in the weeds prose stuff. So it was like, and when they came together, you kind of have this meta conversation between the comics and the prose, if I succeeded.
So one of the things, and a big difference between you and between Alex and Eliza, is Alex is generally considered one of the nicest people in the industry.
I'm a monster. I wouldn't call it.
Nice so far. This can go.
I know Eliza pretty well.
It's an identity that I'm.
But with the I'm kidding. But with the comic sequences, did you? Because for me, I feel like I would just be such a control freak, like a writer with their book cover. Like, I'll defer when I get a cover generally to what the publisher suggests, because I feel like they have a better understanding of what's going to work in the marketplace and what consumers are going to be looking for in a year or so.
Help with.
Yeah, I mean, if it's
marketing, like, okay, that I need help. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I'm a marketing person, so I'm just like I'm a monster.
I am too, but I don't trust, my marketing isn't
I'm
necessarily
work with. For any agents or editors.
I'm the best.
Well, so how was it with your did you feel like I guess you work on comics to the same extent that you do with novels, but was there a difference? I mean, were you more particular with Secret Identity than you would have been otherwise?
I think with the comic sequences, I had just complete trust in Sandy. I've known him a long time, so I felt like he could really evoke what I wanted. And so when I got and he was great because he sent me layouts. And at that stage, that's really when, as an editor, you can chime in and kind of nitpick on stuff. So we went back and forth, but the end result was, it was better than I'd imagined, which is kind of what you hope for any collaboration. So
I've got to assume that comics are more like film in that collaborative space. I mean, I have some author friends who are also interested in film scripts or TV scripts, and I'm always like, yeah, no, because it's so collaborative, and that's just part of that art. Even if you're writing the script, the actor's going to bring their own piece, the director.
Yeah, you have to let some of it go.
It is by its nature letting things go. It's like improv or something. It's just a totally different. Whereas I'm with you, Ed. The real world is chaotic and beyond control, and thus I write novels in which I'm also the antagonist, and I'm also the weather, and I know exactly when,
You are all things, yeah.
Right, and I get lots of time to replay it over and over again until it's perfect. I mean, I'm not a theater person here, but I think comics would be much more like film, because it's relatively rare for someone to do both all the writing and drawing of a comic, right?
You have writers who are also artists. It's not rare, but it's not as common. Usually it's a writer and an artist, but the writer of a comic is like the screenwriter of a movie. You're giving them the script, and the artist is the director who's going to decide on the camera angles and the visual tone and style and vibe. And that's the fun of it. I think you're just kind of putting it into a pot and hoping that the next few ingredients are also equally as good, and the end result is great.
Well, at least in IP, you're also in like a shared universe where you didn't invent these characters necessarily, or they have whole backstories that other characters already worked on, which again would just be very frustrating to some of us.
Well,
Right.
I mean, you just can't break the toys. The
Right.
idea is you're playing
Right.
with them, and you're
in
adding
someone
to
else's
it.
sandbox.
Yeah, you can't really come in and just put your stamp on it too fully, which is, I guess, why we have our own characters.
Do you have, Alex, and we're way off topic
Yeah,
here.
what the hell, Ed?
I know, but it's a good discussion, so I don't think anyone will care.
People are going to be disappointed. You're going to get emails.
From us.
No, not from me. I don't care.
You don't email.
Do you have dang it, see, Eliza, now I can't remember what I was going to say, and it was such a good question. Yeah, we've all had friends who have they had their novels turned into movies, and I've been listening to or TV shows, and I've been listening to a lot of television podcasts lately about with either the writers or the actors and talking about the process. And the fascinating thing, I think a writer's room would be so fun to watch. If I ever sold one of my books for movie, I'd love to go see it. I would hate to be part of it. I can't imagine.
Great news, because you probably wouldn't be.
Yeah, but it says like your Alex, your collaborative efforts. You're not collaborating with other writers necessarily, right? You're working with.
I mean, I do co-write some stuff. Mostly in comics in that space. I co-write stuff, and that's. I don't know if it's because I have a journalism background and you're just less precious with stuff and you're much more deadline driven and willing to get things done together. And maybe the comics part of it makes me more open to collaborating. But I couldn't collaborate on something like Pete, like a Pete book, or it's just he's my character, and I don't think I could have co-written a Carmen book just because I feel very close to those characters and they feel like something that sprung only out of my mind. But if it's something like The Black Ghost or The Dusk or other comics that I've written where you start at zero together and you kind of come up with them together, then I think it's okay. It's easier because the end result is a product of both voices.
Well, and I do think, to segue back to our topic, that you'd have to be more open to that if you were using sensitivity readers and you were trying to capture an identity that they have and you don't. Then you damn well better listen. If they say,
oh, for sure, yeah,
it's not this, it's more like this, then you better be willing to go back to the drawing board and shift that around and be like, okay.
I think that's a little bit, those are notes as opposed to like kind of creating.
But I can see how they'd ruin your whole plot necessarily. Like
you have to be ready for that.
Yeah, be willing to go for that if you're trying to capture a different identity that's not yours.
Yeah, you can't use. I think the sensitivity readers, you can't just use them to check a box and say I have them and it's like a blanket approval. I think it just means that you did the work, but did you take the notes? That's part of the process. You have to take the notes.
So I had a question on that, and then I want to ask each of you to do a reading from your books. But if you had to pick, you were talking about, like Eliza, you just mentioned the that somebody may not have just a small note. They may have a substantial one. Is there something that you've written, like a detail or a plot turn or technique or something that in your own writing that you're really proud of that informed one of your characters?
Alex, you go.
So is there a detail in my writing that informed one of the characters?
Yeah, is there something that like a moment that really stuck out to you that that you're proud of?
My favorite moment.
Did you guys not read my email? I sent this to you.
I deleted it. I mean, I think there's an auto forwarding thing that just goes to my trash. No, I think one of my favorite moments with Carmen, and it's not a spoiler, is she's brainstorming with Harvey, who's her colleague at Triumph Comics, which is kind of a third-rate, not almost Marvel DC, but not quite. And so basically, Carmen's boss says, "You're never going to get a chance to write. Look, so just stop pitching me your story." It's like Carmen is the kind of the buzzy bee that's always like, here's a script, here's an idea, here's something, because it's her dream, it's what she wants. But there's a moment where the boss says, look, I've got a line of guys out the door, friends, people I've worked with. How would it look if I hired my secretary to write a story? And it's a seismic moment for her because it really makes her realize, okay, I've got to do more than just write a good story. I have to overcome this hurdle that this guy is putting in front of me for no clear reason. And so that's not my favorite moment. My favorite moment is when she is approached by her colleague, Harvey, and he says, I have this opportunity to write this character, but I want you to ghostwrite it with me because I know you like to write. And all the red flags are there. She's not deluded. She realizes that down this
never
path.
ghostwrite with a dude.
Yeah. Ghostwriting is problematic. Ghostwriting with this ambitious younger guy is going to be problematic. But she does it anyway because she has no clear path to getting it done. And so there's a scene where they're kind of jamming and creating, and Harvey kind of brings nothing to the table. Like he's kind of like, well, let's make her like Spider-Man, or let's make a character like Batman. And she busts out like this stack of notebooks. Just like she's been working towards this moment since she was a kid. And that to me was like a definitive moment for Carmen, because it just showed that she had to do so much more work to get there. And she was ready, and she was not going to miss her shot, I guess, to quote Hamilton. But she was not going to miss this moment. And I thought that was such a definitive point for Carmen, and I was proud of it because it really like summed her up very clearly.
All right, I have one. It's a bit of a spoiler, but I don't know that there's that many people in the audience who would
mute.
Yeah. So my main character, I described her in the Bone K as kind of a like type A. She's a preservationist. She wants everything to be historically accurate. And the storm comes in, and no surprise, it's sort of destroying lots of things that she cares about. And there's a fellow in the storm who shows up sort of unexpectedly, and he's not a very appealing character. He's a handyman, but she's got a lot more bringing to the table than she does. But he's sort of loud. They have limited supplies, and now there's someone that they weren't prepared for that shows up, who now is consuming resources. She has to work a lot harder now. And there's a pivotal moment in the book where they sleep together. And I will say, talking about writers' rooms and critique groups, I'm in a very tightly connected writers group where we share ideas as we're developing them, and everybody's sort of along for the ride with everybody. There's like 6 of us, and we meet every week and share these ideas and pieces. And they hated this plot point. They hated it. They didn't think that this character would do that. And they kept saying like, but this guy is not appealing. Can you go back and make him like more of a hunk? And I'm like, I don't think that that's the point. That's not, like it's a life or death. Everything's over. This is a very smart character. Kind of like you were saying, Alex, she's aware of what's going on, and she makes this decision anyway. And they were like, but he doesn't really even seduce her. And I'm like, no, he does not. Like, if anything, she hits on him kind of. And they really, really hated it. And like, the group almost like left in a huff at the end of this conversation, because I was not changing it. And it is in the final product. And I asked a lot of other people later, like editors and agents, and like, did that scene make sense to you? Did it work for you? And I don't know.
Like not even your agent, like just random agents?
Just random agents, yeah. Like people who provided blurbs, and anybody who read it later, I always was like, by the way, quick question. That one is a plot decision, and I could have made a different decision, and I don't always think the writer is right. When I say I'm controlling, that first draft is all mine, but then you have to let go, and say, okay, after that, everybody else gets a crack at it.
I think that's great. I think that's fantastic, because sometimes you don't want to give people what they want. I mean, the old saying is you give them what they need. And the fact that they responded so powerfully is a good sign. The fact that
they remembered it and then it bugged them, I was like, I think I'm onto something.
Yeah, it gets them thinking about it.
Great, yeah. And I wasn't writing a romance. Like, of course I know how to write a story in which there's an attractive guy washed up in the storm and then they get together. Like, that's a trope, I was trying to do something different. So I'm proud that it made it into the final version, even though I suspect if I ever read Goodreads, people would be like, what the hell?
Don't go to Goodreads. And also characters make bad decisions, and it's okay to chronicle them.
That's, I think, what I wanted. She's a smart character. She's not tricked. She's not fooled. She makes a bad decision, kind of knowing that it's a bad decision because people make bad decisions.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And she thinks she's going to die. So I think it made sense to me, at least. Ed, do you want to answer your own question?
Well, I felt like no, I don't, but for your
You see how Ed controls this, Alex? He says
he's moderating.
And then it turns out what he really means is like he's going to ask the questions and sit back.
Yeah.
No, I think for your, the scene you're describing, the sex scene in the Bone K did did stand out because, but it's also, it depends how you tell it. You know, Eliza wrote a column for Crime Reads about writing about sex, and I contributed to it. And
I'm also going to be on a panel about writing sex scenes, all women, all sex scenes. It's going to be great.
I think that's great. I wish it was more common in crime fiction, because I don't like that we follow sort of the network TV parameter of violence is fine, but when it comes to sex, let's drift the camera away or anything. I feel like if we're going to use violence as a key to understanding a character, which we often do, sex is just as revealing if we're going to have it in the book. And your sex scene is very well important to those characters' identities too. You know, you're not, the book doesn't change. The tenor of the book doesn't change through with that scene. It's not out of place. You know, it's a choice, and it takes the book into a slightly different direction, maybe, but it has but it really informs the characters. And I think that's something that, as like, I've tried to embrace my own philosophy. So No Home for Killers has more sex than my past books have, but I really want to make sure that I don't do the guy thing and turn them into porn, or over sexualize.
Segue to this topic, which is writing outside identity, which is sex scenes are exactly the type of thing that is very difficult to write outside your identity, because do we really know? You know, in my first unpublished novel, had a male protagonist, and there's a sex scene in that. And people in my writers group were always like, I'm not sure that this is how a man would describe sex. And I'm like, you're probably right, because I'm not a man. And that guy in particular was like kind of a dude bro of a guy. So like, I probably can't imagine what it would be like for him to think about sex or have sex in that way. I would need some helpful beta readers, and no secrets here. Now that I'm a sexpert in sex scenes, apparently, I've had not just one, but two different guys approach me with a scene that they wrote from the woman's perspective of sex, being like, does this seem right to you? And I think that's cool that people are stretching themselves that way to try to do that and not do the James Bond. There's always been sex in crime fiction, but it's you know, the mighty hero nails a woman and then moves on. From the
it'll throw me out. It'll throw me out of a book if I'm reading like. It's my rule of thumb.
James Bond, that's his character. He's hooking up with these broads.
Oh yeah, I mean,
fine, whatever. Like, and that's part of the allure for that reader, I assume too. I mean, Reacher has a lot of sex. You know, in every book, another hot lady wants the Reacher or whatever. But if you're trying to write, as Ed is, a female character, and you're trying to write the sex scene from her point of view, that's a real stretch to try to. I think you probably would need help on that to have people read that for you and ground truth it a little.
I think the idea both for sex and violence is like you have to be mindful that it pushes the plot forward, and it's not. I think once it starts to veer into gratuitous, that's when it's awkward for me as a reader, and it's what I try to avoid as a writer. I mean, I've read books written by men that the sex scenes are just clearly not meant to push the plot in any way. It's not about characters' dynamics changing or anything interesting happening. It's just they wanted to have this scene in there, and that's what pulls me out of the narrative. And it does the same with violence. And I think we should approach them both kind of in similar ways. That, you know, how does it help the book become better, or are you just doing it to kind of work something out in your own head that doesn't really help the narrative?
But if I can push you here, I mean, you wrote a gay woman main character. Do you have a gay female sex scene in that book? And how would that, I mean, imagine that's something we can never know, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's a moment where it's clearly hinted that happens, but I don't describe the scene in detail.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go, probably, unless you were really 100% invested in. And
it's an imperative moment, I think, because it involves a character from her past that she's very conflicted by. So not to spoil anything, but yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing that with your book, and when you did that, Alex, that I really enjoyed is that there's an emotional tension that is really more that really takes priority over the sexual element of the book. And I think that's such a smart decision to make, and not the kind of decision that, not to stereotype, but that a lot of male writers have traditionally made, right? They'll use sex over emotions to show affection.
And I think, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that the moment and that relationship is something, universal. I think we can all relate to the idea of this like painful ex showing up again and kind of haunting our present day. And that to me was more interesting than kind of getting into the weeds of the actual encounter.
Right. I think to draw it back to the theme, if you are writing outside your identity, it's good to have some discretion and think that there are probably some moments you're not going to be able to capture unless it's really, really critical to get into the weeds there in that scene. It's
Right.
probably wiser to have a discretion shot and take us back into more universal territory, because it'd be very difficult to capture that experience outside your own identity.
So we have probably about 10 to 15 minutes left, and I wanted to, this is a perfect segue, because speaking of sex, I was going to ask each of you to read a short excerpt from your books. So whoever wants to go first.
I'm happy to go first.
All right, go first.
Sure. Okay, so I will read the prologue from Secret Identity, which is a flashback to Carmen's youth. So, okay. I actually have the finished copies, which is exciting. For me, at least. Okay, her eyes fluttered open at the sound. Carmen Valdez rolled out of her small twin bed with ease, the muscle memory kicking in. Even now, in the middle of the night. The shrill scream was familiar, too. She tiptoed across her small bedroom, avoiding the toys strewn on the floor as she made her way to the door. Another scream. Mommy. The screaming and arguing were routine. Carmen found that she'd become numb to it. She could almost predict it in the hours before bed. If Mommy and Papi were drinking that stuff, it was a bad sign. It meant they were changing, becoming meaner, darker, something else. She would rush through her routine, rush to get to the relative safety of her room, her closed door, her darkness. But she also knew the darkness could only shield her from so much. It hid her, but it didn't silence them. She knew the screams would come. Carmen would just pray she could sleep through them. She took the steps slowly and sat in her usual spot. They lived in a compact 3-bedroom house in a suburban slice of Miami. It was worn out in a lived-in, comfortable way. It was home. Carmen loved it here, felt safe here, most of the time. She held onto the spindles of the thick faux wood banister and looked down onto the tiny living room, lit only by a flickering lamp that loomed over her parents. The screaming had stopped for now, replaced by a sound Carmen had never heard, at least not from her father. Sobbing. ¿Por qué? ¿Por qué, Clara? Why? Why are you doing this? Her father's stiff, unfamiliar English surprised Carmen. Her parents always spoke to each other in Spanish. It was their language, their way. English was something else, a chore, a means to an end. To hear her Cuban father force himself to speak English, while crying no less, gave Carmen a disorienting feeling that made her question if she was even awake. Get up, Pepe, párate. Háblame como un hombre, por Dios, Carmen's mother said, her words tight and seething through gritted teeth. Her father's sobs continued, racked, painful cries that amplified Carmen's dizzy, frightened feelings. The ground under her felt uncertain. Her world seemed shaken and malleable. She didn't like that. She felt her face redden, the tears sliding down her cheeks slowly as she fought back the whimpering sounds she knew would come anyway. What had she done? What had made her parents this way? What could she do to fix it? Before she could ponder it further, her mother's eyes met hers, pulsing with rage at first, then softening with surprise and shame, the entire spectrum of emotions playing out in less than a second. Carmen tried to push herself back into the shadows, but it was too late. She'd been spotted. She did it anyway. She heard her mother's slow footfalls as she approached the banister, could almost feel her looking up at the spot where Carmen had been. Carmencita, ¿qué haces? Her mother asked, her voice mannered and forced, clearly trying not to sound like she'd had too much of that stuff to drink, trying to sound like she was her usual daytime mommy. Es muy tarde, mijita. Carmen didn't respond. She pivoted her small body away from her crying father and slowly crept back to her room. Carmen had built defenses for these nights, these dark moments where her life felt unmoored, unsafe. She'd think about better times, warmer times, walking to La Farmacia with Papi, his big hand in hers, the smell of his sweat and cologne mixing together to create a familiar, comforting feeling, his worn features shifting into a tired smile as he held the door open for her, his princesa. They wouldn't go far. They didn't come to the pharmacy for medicine usually. They'd make a beeline for the magazine aisle, past the glossies and paperback books to a wireframe spinner rack, loaded with pictures so colorful and welcoming that they practically whispered Carmen's name as she approached. The red, white, and yellow of the Flash, the patriotic gear of Captain America, the muted green and yellow insectoid uniform of the Fly, the gray, red, and black of the Dusk. It was their ritual, their special routine. Boppy would walk with her. She'd step back and watch him spin the rack, his fingers gently touching the stacks of comics as it went around and around. He'd grab one or two, show them to Carmen, and then recite a brief description. Batman tiene mucha fuerza, pero es muy inteligente también, Carmencita. Or Captain America, un hombre bueno, decente. Then they'd walk to the cash register, and like clockwork, her father would tell her how, as a newly arrived Cuban immigrant with a wife and baby daughter, he'd learned to read English with comics. Learned about this country they now called home from the adventures of people like Superman, the Blue Beetle, Martian Manhunter, or the Freedom Alliance. Carmen would nod and smile. She knew the story by heart, but she loved it. She loved this man, good-hearted and strong, fallible, but always striving to be better. Carmen thought back to those moments as she climbed the stairs on all fours, like a cat trying to wiggle through a fence without making a sound. She needed to go back to her safe place. She needed to cover herself, hide herself with a cloak of her own creation. Only then, in her cramped room, loaded with boxes of comics and drawings and ideas, would she be safe. She had to become someone else. Thanks.
That's so good. And like I said, it's such a good introduction
Oh,
to the book. And I love how you describe that early love of going through a comic book rack and seeing what's there and your parents buying you as many as you want. And there's nothing more exciting than seeing the new editions are out. I love those days. I wish I was so that was a really fond moment for me when I read that.
Oh yeah, me too. I mean, I remember going to the newsstand with my dad or the comic shop and just being so excited when new books were out. But yeah, it's a very evocative moment. Thanks.
Yeah. Eliza?
Okay, I'm reading from All That's Bright and Gone here because it's got the better sense of identity that I don't possess. I know my brother is dead. I'm not dumb like Hazel Merkowitz from up the street says. Sometimes Mama just gets confused is all. Like every year on the feast of St. Theodore, his birthday, Mama sets out an extra plate for Theo with a candle on it instead of food, because I guess Theo isn't hungry. And Mama says, "Isn't this nice? It's like we're all together again." I guess it's nice. Alfie? Alfie Scott? That man with the clipboard probably means me. I stand up. "Come on, Teddy," I whisper. I cover my mouth with my hand because Mama always tells me not to talk to Teddy out loud, where strangers can hear me. Teddy gets up when I do, walking on all fours behind me with his big head hanging down. We go over to the clipboard man, who is wearing pale blue pajamas, and I say, "Here I am." "Is it Alfie, sweetheart? Did I get it right?" "It's Aoife," I say. Aoife, Aoife. I have to say it a lot. Grown-ups never get it right. "Oh, okay, Eva, why don't you come along with me and we'll go see the doc, okay?" Teddy growls, but I pretend not to hear him. "Okay," I say. We walk together down a white hallway that smells like bleach. "That's a real interesting name you've got," says the clipboard man. The spelling of it, I mean. My mama's name is Siobhan," I say. "It's spelled Bhan. Wow, I guess y'all must be Irish, huh?" "No," I say politely. "We're from Chicago." The man stops at the white wooden door and knocks. "Come in," says someone from inside. "Dr. Perlman, this is Eva Scott," he says, putting a hand on my shoulder and pushing me in. "She's the little girl who was brought in from Westgate Mall." "Ah, yes, Eva, hello," says Dr. Perlman. "She's a gray-haired lady with a big necklace of yellow beads. There's yellow beads hanging from her ears, too. Teddy doesn't like her." "It's with a F," I say. "Aoife." She looks down at her file. "What an unusual name," she says. "I've never seen it before." "It's after my grandmother," I say, because that's what Mama always says. "And my middle name is Joan because my birthday is on her special day. I like that Joan is my saint because she's very brave. Mama says that Joan was a warrior, and Aoife is a warrior's name too, back in the old country." How lovely. Dr. Pullman doesn't know it, but Teddy is biting her shoe. He's going to pull it right off her feet if she is not careful. "And how old are you, Aoife?" 6. "That's great," she says. I'm not really sure why it's great, but I nod anyway. "Well, come sit inside. Why don't we sit down and talk over here?" "I think I have some Play-Doh. Would you like that?" I nod. Mama doesn't let me play with Play-Doh because it makes a mess, but Dr. Perlman does not have to know that. She hands me a carton with a blue lid. My favorite color is red, but I can be a big girl, so I don't complain. I peel back the lid and I stick my nose in it because I like how it smells like melted crayons. Then I dump it out on the table and start to make snakes. I always start by making snakes. So Aoife, can you tell me what happened this morning? She asks. She says my name pretty close to right. I can hear the F. Still, Teddy shakes his head no. He doesn't want me to say. I don't know, I say. Dr. Perlman sighs. Tell me about your mommy. I don't call her mommy. I call her mama. Her name's Siobhan, and she's trying to teach me cartwheels, but I can't do them that good. I think how to describe mama. If she was an animal, she'd be a horse, because she'd be pretty and nice and have long hair. If I could pick any animal, I'd be a bear for sure, as big as Teddy, as big as a house. But if I had to pick the animal that is most like me, I'd probably be maybe a squirrel or a chipmunk. But I'd rather be a bear. I'll stop there.
That was great.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm one of the people that was really surprised that you don't have kids to capture that voice. Was that one thing? One thing I've wanted to ask was, did you ever have to? Did you ever find yourself going too much into sentimentality or making the child too precious? I mean, how did you keep it?
How'd you really hard not to. And actually, I think what is even more challenging is like when you read kids in books, they're almost always precocious. Like they always, just for plot reasons, because it's a lot easier to write a character that can do a little more. And like, I really, really tried to keep away from that. So Aoife is like not even very smart for a 6-year-old. She never learns to read and she never actually develops theory of mind. Even at the end of the book, she can't really understand why people do the things they do, because she's 6. She's just 6 years old and she's sort of been neglected. So she's not even a mature 6. I sort of took her down to my niece at more like 4 or 5 to try to get it. So I tried not to make her sentimental or very smart. She's smart in her own way, but she's not very capable.
So we have to close up, but I did want to ask one last question for each of you. What are you working on next?
Alex?
I can't say a lot about it, but I'm working on my next crime novel. And I'm also finishing up the script for this comic book called The Mysterious Microface, which is with NPR's Planet Money. And it's a kind of a spin-off of a series of episodes they did where they explored intellectual property and they decided to kind of do a comic book based on this character from the public domain. And they asked me to write it, and it's kind of bizarre to be writing an NPR comic book, but it's neat.
That's cool. That's a cool project.
Yeah, so that's coming out soon.
People ask you what you're doing because in the publishing world, a lot of things are secret, and there's all sorts of restrictions. And sometimes you don't know. With my first book, everybody always asked me, "So what's your next book?" And I was like, "Hey, do you talk to my editor? Because
I don't know yet.
Too much deal. So like who knows? Maybe."
Though I do have a kid in my next novel, and I like what you said that not to use them as a plot device, like to have them just be a kid, and that's going to be challenging. But it's something I think about.
Yeah, I really needed to. I debated giving Aoife a bike so she could literally just get further places. She doesn't leave her neighborhood because she has no way to get anywhere, and she's trying to sneak away. So like the furthest she goes is like down the street. It makes it really hard to have a big novel in a very
and even with a bike, you don't really see like kids that age like getting too far with them. Yeah.
No, I was always asking my sister, like, does a 6-year-old shower? She was like, no, they don't shower. Does a 6-year-old ride in the front seat? No, they don't ride in the front seat. It's a limited perspective. That's what makes it fun. My next project is about birds, so we'll see. I really hope there's an avid reading audience for bird facts and like bird mysteries.
Bird noir.
I've been describing this project as a cross between H's for Hawk and The Sopranos. So I think it's going to be great.
That sounds cool.
All right.
And your future projects?
I am in the editing phase for No Home for Killers. So that's where I am now, but I have that. So I'm doing edits the first part of this year, and they're great. I really like the editor I'm working with. She's been fantastic. So that's really exciting for me. And then but the next novel's due at the end of the year. This will be the first time I've had to edit and write in such a short order. And I'm not the kind of person who can work on 2 big projects simultaneously.
It's hard.
Yeah, I mean, I can work on a big project and a small project, but 2 novels, they have to be spaced apart for me.
I have 2 books coming out this year. The second one, which is not announced, but it made it uniquely challenging.
You haven't announced that yet. I keep trying. I follow everything you do. So
you get email alerts when
I didn't know this.
Yeah.
Like stupid Google alert.
Coming soon.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alex and Eliza. Do me a favor if you can, hold up your books so everybody can see their covers and knows. And you can get those at bookstores and online, anywhere you shop. Thank you once again to Kathleen Kelly and everyone at Suffolk Mystery Authors Festival. So happy to be part of it this year, and hope you enjoy the rest of the panels.
Thanks for having us. Thanks, Ed. You did great.
We appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.